Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to the launch of Bilateral. My name is Hiba Ali. I am a senior advisor at the Coalition for the UN We Need, or C4UN. Bilateral is a new conversation series hosted by the Coalition for the UN We Need to discuss transforming global governance and reforming the UN. So every month or two, we will be hosting a fireside chat with a leader or thinker that we feel can help us dive into this question of how we achieve the UN we need. Today is, of course, United Nations Day, so no better day to launch the series and no better day to assess how the UN is doing in light of, in particular, the recent Summit of the Future. This conversation series is part of the Coalition for the UN We Need's new strategy to engage in more thought leadership in this space. And that is because we feel that there is a risk of hitting a wall in terms of the ambition that governments are willing to show if we don't build broader buy-in for global governance reform and international cooperation among the broader public. And the theory of change is that once you do that, the public can then push their governments to engage in reform and better yet, elect leaders who are ready to do so. It is remarkable, if you think about it, that the Summit of the Future process left almost everyone, including governments, unsatisfied and wanting more. And while the summit did not, at least in my view, deliver the UN we need, it did result in a much wider appreciation among civil society, among governments, among diplomats, among the global public, that addressing structural governance issues is necessary and important. So now it becomes a necessity to find the means to achieve those bigger structural changes that we all know must come. And that is, among other things, what this conversation series hopes to contribute to. If you want to make sure you get news of the next one, sign up to C4UN's mailing list, and we'll put the link in the chat. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome our first bilateral guest, Stefan Löfven, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, a member of the Club de Madrid, and co-chair of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. Stefan is, to my mind anyway, one of those former heads of state who is down to earth and who genuinely cares about the vision of a shared planet. So I'm very happy to be speaking with him today. Stefan, welcome to Bilateral.
Thank you so much, Eva. I really appreciate it. And thank you for highlighting the United Nations Day, and congratulations for that as well.
So there are many things I want to discuss with you, and I'll also be weaving in questions from the audience. But before we get into all of that, I want to just, out of curiosity, know, how does a former head of state spend their time?
Oh, well, now I get to choose what I want to do. The first thing I decided to do was to support a good friend, Kailash Satyarthi, a Nobel Prize laureate the same year as Malala Yousafzai. And Kailash had been spending his whole adult life trying to combat child labor. And I got to know him when he was a Nobel Prize winner, and we kept the contact. So I decided I want to help him the best I can. He's one of my heroes. I've been working with the High-Level Advisory Board, as you mentioned. I am the president of the European Social Democrats, and also chairperson of the Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and some other things. So yeah, it's a very interesting life.
A busy one, it sounds like, but I imagine less stressful than when you were in government. But now I want you to kind of take off all of those professional hats that you wear. You describe yourself as an optimist and as a reformist. So not as the head of the board of SIPRI, not as the co-chair of HLAB, not as the former head of state, but just as Stefan. What is your vision or aspiration? What do you think the world should or could look like in 50 years?
I think we've overcome the dark times that we're in now. I think there's politics can deliver a society that brings out the best of people or the worst of people. And right now we're in a wave, not all over the world, but in too many countries, too many regions where society brings out the worst of people. But I think that is a part of the long-term waves in history. And I think we're going to come out of that because people, at the end of the day, want to do good. Most of the people want to do good, want to find solutions, want to live in solidarity with one another. So I think we're at a better stage. I think we found a way to bridge the gap between North and South. It is adequate and relevant for South to say to North, or the developing world to say to develop, whatever we call ourselves, that we need to do more and we need to share in a better way. And I think we've overcome that gap in 50 years. So, and of course, that we managed to deal with the climate issue in such a way that our grandchildren also can say that they live in a good world, and that they actually can say, thank you, you finally understood where we're going and you finally acted, so thank you for that.
As a co-reformist, I would say I'm often accused of being naive. So now if you put your former head of state hat back on, when you think of what you've just described, so overcoming the gap between the global North and the global South and dealing with the climate issue, what do you see as a viable path for us to get to that vision?
Well, first, we know that according to UN calculations, that to achieve the SDGs, at the end of 2030, we need some 5, 6, perhaps $7 trillion annually. And that is a lot of money. But if we look at the wealth in the world, not least private wealth, we have enough. We have more than enough. So we know that the resources are there, and we need to start thinking more of investing, so that also there is a win-win perspective. If we can invest more in Global South, which we need to do, we must do that. That will be a good thing for the South, the people there, the countries there, the region, Africa as an example. But it is also a good thing for the richer part of the world, because if you lift poor people out of poverty, we know that it also helps the economy for everybody. So by shifting the narrative from handing out money to investment, I think, and we know that we have more than enough of resources in the world. You know, if you want to have $1 trillion and you ask the richest people in the world, you only need 6 people. 6 people, they have together $1 trillion. And I often say that we're not going to rob them, but I'm saying this because we must show that the world has enough resources. And we know that Africa, as an example, is the continent that will grow substantially in terms of population and a demography that is very good in terms of workforce. So not investing there is a failure, is a huge mistake. So if we just get the hang of it, I know that we can do so much good.
But is it a question of getting the hang of it? Because you talk about the money being available, and yet it's not being directed in the ways that I think you would like to see happen. And so what is it that would change that dynamic?
We also need to invest in, make sure that countries, let's say in Africa, that all countries there are prepared to absorb, and that financial resources can be absorbed in the society, meaning that you have channels to channeling it to training, education, to housing, not least electricity. You know that some 700 million people in the world lack electricity to their household, and that's a huge project to start investing in, but it's doable. So but you have to, again, I think it's a lot about narrative, and if you can just showcase again that the growth in terms of population will not be in the West, in the North, in the developed world. It'll be in other parts of the world. And then we can highlight, here's the future. Here you need investment. But of course, you also need societies that are trustworthy, that there is a structure, there is a judicial structure, there is, of course, democracy and all that. So these need to go hand in hand. We cannot be naive, but I think we have a lot to do to gather North and South and see this is what we can do, both of us, and we will end up in a much, much better world. Because letting things be like it is today would be a huge mistake, because we can see now the gaps are widening between North and South. And that if this continues, we'll have even worse problem that we have today. So we have to start getting closer to one another and develop a future vision of where we're going. I think Pact for the Future is far from perfect, but it was a signal from the General Assembly we want to do things differently.
So let's turn to the Pact for the Future. The Summit of the Future, of course, was held in New York last month. It was described as this once-in-a-generation opportunity to forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like. How do you reflect on that process today? And in particular, I want to flag this comment that I heard Mark Malloch-Brown, the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, making at an event on the sidelines of the summit. And he said, there have to be new ways to arrive at a global consensus on change than 193 diplomats fighting over the placement of commas.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, when you think of the process of the summit, given your thoughts about narrative and how change needs to happen, how do you reflect on the Pact and how it unfolded?
Well, when I was co-chairing together with Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, the high-level advisory board, one of the issues that we brought up was this, that you have to bring in more people. It's not only politicians, it's not only diplomats, it's the civil society, it's the private sector and all that. So bringing more people into the process. And so during our process with our report, we did that. And if you look at the Summit of the Future, 2 days before, the action days were full of activities, including all these different actors and stakeholders. So I think that is extremely important, because that's the way you build also trust. The more people that are involved in the process, the better outcome, the better understanding for the change and the needs. So that is crucial. But on the other hand, you can't just say, well, now we lock the door for the politicians, let someone else do this, because at the end of the day, it'll be governments and parliaments that can take the decisions that we need to have in terms of financing, in terms of investment, and so on. So we need that combination. But I think it was crucial to bring in more actors. And one thing that is already ongoing is to bring in youth in a much clearer way, so that the youth envoy, we full-heartedly supported that. I think it's important that youth can take more part in this process, because it's more about their future than mine. So they have to have more saying. So bring in more people, but don't underestimate the importance of governments sitting there. So when it comes to diplomats, I can understand his point, because we were very cautious in saying, don't let everything now go to the diplomats in New York. And I respect them. It's not disrespectful. I respect the work, but we need politicians, political leaders, presidents, prime ministers and others to say to the diplomats, this is what we want you to do. This is what we want to achieve. To be honest, the first draft was not a good one. So I even said, if this is one you're putting on the General Assembly's table, please don't. It's better to have nothing than to have this. But The fourth draft was different, and I would have wanted even more concrete things, but you can find good things there. And now it's crucial to find the structure on how to go forward. How do we go forward on the financial issues? How we do go forward on the new technology and the AI and all of that? How do we go forward with higher participation rate, and so on and so on?
It's interesting that you talked about this, if I understand you well, as an inclusive process. I think many in civil society felt that it wasn't, because they didn't have access to the negotiations, and that it was, in fact, very much closed off. And by some arguments, that's why the result was less ambitious. And so I'm wondering if you think overall that the summit was a success.
Not a success in that we got all the decisions that we wanted. I was referring to the high-level advisory board. So when we conducted our process, we reached out, and we have a lot of inputs from civil society, youth organization, a religious organization, and all that. So we tried to. I'm not saying it was perfect, but the high-level advisory board, we emphasized that from the beginning when we started, and I think we had a lot of input. No, the Summit of the Future is far from perfect. The Pact for the Future is far from perfect, but you have statements like we need to get rid of the nuclear weapons. Our high-level advisory board, we suggested put an end to nuclear weapons in 2045. Then we've had at the latest, because then we had a century of craziness, because nuclear weapons is such a mistake for humankind, for mankind. So, and the Pact for the Future doesn't say that, but it says that we should get rid of nuclear weapons. So my point is, all these statements in the Pact, now it's up to us, among others, to bring those forward, to say, okay, you said this in the Pact for the Future, so what are we doing now to take another step and another step? On the financing issue, the same thing. How do we do now? Where is the next forum? Where is the next opportunity to push this forward?
And I want to come back to that question of how you push it forward, but just staying on the Pact for a minute, you talked about the nuclear weapons statement. What else jumps out at you from the Pact as ideas that you think are going to be real game changers in the future? Some of the ones that come to mind, there was a commitment to develop a framework for progress that goes beyond GDP. Just the notion that future generations need to be protected. The question of voice and representation in international financial institutions. So, there are quite a few nuggets in there, as you say. Which of the ones, which for you are the ones that really have the potential to change the system dramatically in the future?
I think first I need to mention, since I'm engaged in combating child labor, I think that was also clearly expressed in this. So that is something that we need to keep pushing for. How do we do that? Another issue that is much discussed now, and where we can see at least a change in rhetoric and thinking, and that is the global financial architecture. Meaning that first, again, we need to make sure that we have enough of financial resources to do the investment that we need to do to make those investments, and it's also about democracy, in giving, again, a global South more of a saying, make the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, more democratic, so that not only the richer part of the world get to decide what will happen. So, and there you can see something is happening, and there are several initiatives. Next year, there's a big summit in Spain, that gives us an opportunity to bring this issue forward. More investment, bridge the gap between North and South, make these institutions more democratic so that we're more on equal foot in the decision making between North and South. So I think there you can see, I mean, it hasn't shifted 180 degrees all of a sudden, but you can see things are happening. The institutions are more ready to discuss this.
When you look at the Pact more broadly and compare it to some of the, let's say, more ambitious ideas that you had originally outlined in the high-level advisory board's report, which was, of course, meant to inform the Pact. You mentioned that, the commitment to nuclear non-proliferation, I can never say that word properly, proliferation was taken forward. Are there other elements from your original vision that you see in the Pact and or not in the Pact? So to what extent do you think that kind of bigger vision that you had actually translated into language in this agreed document?
A better participation is dealt with, not in a perfect way. None of this is in a perfect way, but still dealt with. The climate also, and the need to make sure that we reduce emissions. We wanted to go further. We wanted to have a pact with the earth, so to speak, a track between people and the earth, and being very clear on going to zero and all that. The text in general is more blurry in the Pact, but then again, it's up to us not to just keep pushing for this and say, this we need to do, that we need to do. On financing, I just said that there is, as far as I can see, change. On the Security Council, yes, it is clearly stated that the Security Council need to be more, to have more fair representation. But then again, it's very blurry. It doesn't say anything how. But if you interpret the text, you can clearly argue that the General Assembly been clear that you have huge countries with no representation today. They're not permanent members. That should be permanent members. So I think there are arguments for India, for Brazil. African continent, again, is the continent that will grow this century. So if we just now keep them busy, those are responsible for bringing this forward. We know that Joe Biden last year, also even 2 years ago, expressed clearly from the United States point of view, yes, we see the need of changing the Security Council.
I would argue it's easy for him to say that because he knows it's not going to happen, and so he can appear to be progressive without actually having to pay any price.
But can I understand that? I think I can understand that thinking, and it has been discussed so long, so I can think the same thing. I think there is a different momentum now, and that is because not least because of the fight, the combat between China and US, and what that has led to. And we see a multipolar world. We see groups of countries. We see BRICS Plus and other groups. And I do believe that the superpowers also understand that if they want to keep a good contact, a good relation with the developing world, they have to really do some substantial change. What it means, I don't know, but I think we need to take this opportunity and let them compete on how to make the best for the developing world. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. And just to showcase a detail in this, when we in the high-level advisory board discussed the Security Council, we said the same thing. We were clear on what principles, the poorer part of the world, developing part of the world, the huge countries and all that. We never got into details exactly who countries should be a new permanent member, because also we found out that if you propose a number of new permanent members, which is natural, you also have to consider, if you give more, let's say you put in 5 new permanent members in the Security Council, if they also, in fairness, should have a veto right, then you have 10 countries with veto rights. So the question is, would that help the world community to take decisions, or could it be even the other way around? And if you do not give them the veto right, you have one block of countries permanent with veto rights, another block permanent without veto rights, and then a third group, not non-permanent members. So we have to think this through. It's not always a clear choice.
Well, I think the clearest choice is to engage in Security Council reform on 2 fronts: expanding the membership while at the same time reducing the scope and use of the veto for all those who have the veto. And there are some, I think, interesting proposals to that end. But I want to come back to your point about US-China competition, because we actually got a question from the audience. And I don't know if Anthony Valian, if you're here, and if you are, please feel free to unmute yourself. But is that you, Anthony?
Yes, I'm here, Hiba. Thank you.
Please go ahead and ask your question, because I think it's quite relevant.
Thank you very much. With the discussion on US-China, I was thinking, how should the UN engage with and respond to the US-China competition? And then how can it achieve more cooperation?
Well, I think the main responsibility lies with these 2 countries. I don't know if you have read the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, wrote a book about this existential competition that is, and that they have to find a way of dealing with it. They have a responsibility to make clear what are the red lines. But second, where should we be able to compete in a good way? And the third was, where should we cooperate? And if the world community can offer areas for cooperation where China and US can take a huge responsibility, which they should, because it's in their interest as well. So if UN can facilitate those kind of activities, that I think would be a good thing, and also push these superpowers to take their responsibility. So facilitating and be that actor as UN has always been, but of course also standing up for the charter and the human rights and all that is clear. But I think sometimes we put too much. I mean, United Nations is extremely important, not least in these days. But sometimes we lay the responsibility, we put the whole responsibility on Guterres and the United Nations. And we forget that in all organizations, it is the members that have to do the right thing. In my party, the party that I was sharing, the trade union I was sharing, the football club and all that, it's the members at the end of the day that have to show we take responsibility. So I think in this case, it's always, but UN can be a very good facilitator and bring people together.
So let me take Anthony's question a step further, because it echoes actually a similar question we received from Azita Berar, who asked how Europe could mediate between the grievances of the Global South and the Global North. And I would say, how should the UN mediate that contestation? And you talked about it earlier. There was a very interesting finding from the 2024 Multilateralism Index, which was just recently released by the International Peace Institute and the Institute for Economics and Peace. And they found that participation in multilateralism increased while performance of multilateralism decreased. And many interpreted that as showing that the quote-unquote bad actors are engaging in the system, so they are participating, but they're engaging in order to disrupt it. or in order to reshape it in their own model. Whereas there's another interpretation, I think, of that, which is that the global South is tired of just accepting the rules that are set by the global North, and thus you have harder time getting agreement. And we saw that play out during the summit of the future negotiations. But that may not necessarily be a bad thing, because it means that an empowered global South is demanding a more equitable system where its voice can be heard seriously. And so there, it does raise a challenge, I think, for the UN in navigating that shifting power landscape, which on the one hand is a good thing because it gives more power to countries that historically haven't had it, but on the other hand, leads to more contestation and thus less cooperation in a sense.
No, that's very, very relevant, and you're right. I mean, there are actors clearly that, I mean, if you take the Paris Agreement as one example, there are those who don't want this change that is needed because they're making a lot of money on oil and gas and all that, all the CO2. So that is clear. Whereas the global South, I need also, rightly so, is quite angry. And in the global North or the developed world, again, whatever we call ourselves, we have to acknowledge and we have to express that we have done a lot of things wrong. Anything from, I mean, the colonialism and all that, and a lack of investment, decision-making that is not equitable, and all that. We've done this, we get it. And then we have to show substantially that we are serious in changing. And that is why I keep calling for these investments that we have the resources, we have the money, we have the knowledge of doing the projects that we need to do so. So in that sense, I think Global South is right. What I fear now is that the Global South also using this to not stand up for all the time for the rights, the international law, to be clear. For me, not saying that the Russian attack on Ukraine is wrong, to not say that is wrong. I mean, it's a huge attack on international law. So we have to acknowledge that. So,
but again, that's coming from a place of a history of double standards in the application of international law.
I know, but still, if now all of a sudden the Russian attack on Ukraine is, well, it happens, then the previous one was also okay. So we have to, and I understand the complexity, and I do respect their anger and the disappointment. I do that, and that is why we have to show that we are serious in changing. That don't just talk, do things. So that is why we propose things that we did in the high-level advisory board. Everything from the global financial architecture system to this project that I was really advocating. Let's start a project with aiming at having all the people in the world electricity in their household. That would be a very concrete vision. Not an easy one, huge project, but it's possible.
You keep coming back to this idea of investing in the Global South, in Africa, in a way that is a win-win. But we are seeing a turn to the right in many countries, including your own, and very much the mentality that it is not a win-win because we are suffering at home. Why should we invest abroad? And why should we even bother with global governance and, reforming the UN when what we care about today is the cost of living crisis, domestically? So I'm still not clear on what is the pathway in which we convince right-leaning governments that this matters and that they should be pushing for some of these more ambitious reforms in the global architecture.
I'm not really sure that we convince them, but we should be able to, we could also argue with the business sector. If you take the Chinese example, and I'm not defending the Chinese system. It's not the system that I want in my country, and not in any country. But it is a fact that some 400 million people or more, it's argued how many it is, was lifted out of poverty into some kind of middle class, lower middle class, middle, and so on. Now, that was good for them and for China, but such a huge amount of people being lifted out of poverty means that they can also contribute in the economy, because they will do some more, they can buy some more food, more shoes, perhaps 1, 2, or 3, and 10 buy a car. And that is why President Lula, on his first term in Brazil, introduced the Bolsa de Familia. He knew, coming from very poor conditions, that if the poor people get some financial resources, they will not put it in the bank account. They will consume, because they need to consume. And when they consume, they get a better life, but they also contribute in the economy. And so I think we haven't discussed this really well enough. Also with the private sector. I mean, private sector they need consumers. They need people to buy their products. It needs to be green and I mean substantial. But anyhow, so I'm not sure that I can convince the far right here in Sweden. I don't think so, because they don't think that way. They don't even think it's a problem that we have such gaps between richer and poor. It's not a problem for them. For me, it's a huge problem. And I think the majority of the people wants a society where we can have more equal standards and equal rights. I am just convinced if that's not the case, well, then we have a huge problem. But I'm going to argue for it until the day I die.
Well, I want to come to a slightly different question on strategy, which is one from Javier Sureski. If you're with us, Javier.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Hiva, for this opportunity. My question is, considering your experience, would it be preferable to pursue a comprehensive and far-reaching reform of the multilateral system, or to follow a more targeted approach focusing on specific institutions and processes? I think that both have pros and cons, and it's hard to me to identify what will be the best way to follow.
It's a tricky one. On the one hand, you can see a lot of things that you want to do and need to do. I am a bit afraid, though, of, let's say, you throw everything in the air and you start all over again. Because, not least in these days, you never know where that ends up. We do have forces around the world that wants a totally different world order, and that is not in a good, what we mean is a good world order. So what I just said also about, if you look at the global financial architecture, the system, IMF and the World Bank and all those regional banks and all that, I think there is an increased awareness of the need to change. So if we take that opportunity and push it as hard as we can, I think we can reach results. I hope I'm not being too naive, but I think I can hear that more and more people understand we need to do this differently, both in terms of the amount of investment, but also in terms of democracy within these institutions, and dealing with the debt issue. More and more people understand that you can't keep poorer countries in this debt situation, because it will prevent them from doing what they need to do. So there is a raised awareness, and I think we should use that opportunity instead of saying we change everything.
Very interesting. Because I'm reading into Javier's question the need for a more comprehensive approach to reform. And if you look at all of the aspects of the report that the High-Level Advisory Board produced is very wide-ranging. And if you try to tackle, each of those areas individually, well, first of all, I don't know, I guess you'd have to pick and choose in a sense. And I keep coming back to this question about pathways for change, because as many will know, I'm a believer in charter reform. We talked about it a little bit. And actually many members of the C4 UN coalition are as well. And I coordinate a coalition that's trying to mobilize member states in triggering a full review of the UN Charter as a way of doing all of this in a more comprehensive, through a comprehensive process rather than a piecemeal approach of kind of whack-a-mole, dealing with one crisis, another crisis pops up. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because the HLAB report did voice its support for triggering Article 109 and having a review of the UN Charter for the purposes of Security Council reform. But could this be the kind of the international community's next global governance conversation in order to take a more comprehensive approach while still pursuing, financial reform where we have opportunities, but knowing that there's a kind of bigger, more structural piece that needs to happen?
Well, I did not say that we should not reflect on Article 109. But what I tried to say was that if you throw everything in there and see where it lands, I don't think that's the right way to go. It does not mean that we should only look at one issue and then spend 10 years with that and then another issue. That's not. So I'm glad you brought this issue up, because this question up, because that if I said that, if I interpreted it that way, that was wrong. So we need to do several things, but I am a bit worried to throw things up in the air and just see, we don't know where that will end up. So Article 109 discussion as an example, I think it's fair to have one. It is ongoing, so we can't just hide that. But I think it's smarter to do that in a way that you start thinking about, okay, what can happen? What could be the end game of that discussion? Because again, we know we have forces that want to weaken the United Nations, not strengthen it. I want to strengthen the United Nations. I want to strengthen the multilateral cooperation, because I think it's needed. But you have forces that are going to go in the other direction. So we just have to think things through what steps we can take, but not just concentrate on one issue for a year and another issue the next 5 years. That was not my intention.
Thanks for clarifying. And on the question of vision, we can throw into the chat some very interesting work that the Global Governance Forum has done in drafting what a new charter could look like, so as to answer that question of what would be the outcome. And although I understand you're speaking more at a political level. But I just want to ask one more question on this, because I think it speaks to a broader question around change and leadership. Interestingly, the Global Governance Forum last year launched a call for charter reform, and it was signed by many former heads of state. And what became clear was that as soon as people leave office, they endorse this idea because they recognize that the structural change is needed. But I mean, what that raises for me is, what is the point of being in power if you can't use that power to drive change? So I'm curious how, all of what we've been talking here, depends on a certain willingness of leadership to use its power for good. And how do we make it such that politicians are ready to back big, bold ideas while they are in office and actually in a position to change things?
Yeah, well, I can only speak for myself. First, there is, of course, I mean, with all these countries in the United Nations, it's not easy you have to somehow, you need this forum, that's for sure, but it's very complicated, of course, to make all these countries go in the same direction. That's not an easy thing to do. And that is why I mean, we have a lot to do already within the UN Charter with the rules that we have. But except we need to change the Security Council. That's obvious. and other things as well. We can strengthen the General Assembly perhaps even more. Now, General Assembly, the rules, as you know, are changed now. So when you use the veto right now in the Security Council, you have to go to the General Assembly and explain yourself. That's not going to stop the use of veto right, but it is a small obstacle. It is a small step in the right direction. So at least you are questioned. Why did you do that? So I think we have a lot to do within the existing rules, because I mean the Declaration of the Human Rights says everything, and then it's about accountability. There we have more to do, absolutely. So both the ICC and the ICJ can be used in a better way, because accountability, definitely we need more of that. So there are absolutely things we need to do, well, we tried to, when we were working in the high-level advisory board, to be, because the Secretary General asked us to do two things primarily: try to be concrete and be bold. That's what I want you to be. And that is why we kept asking ourselves, how? No new statements. How are we going to do this? And we tried to be bold. But of course, it's easier when you don't have to go to the Parliament every month or every week to explain yourself. It's more of freedom once you leave. But I must say, though, that even when I was Prime Minister, we did fight for the United Nations. We did fight for women's rights. We introduced a feminist foreign policy, and many countries just shook their heads and said, what's that? What's that? Now we have more and more countries adapting the thought that we need a foreign policy that is a feminist one. So you can make a difference also when you're in power.
But so what do you learn from that in terms of what works? Because if we take some of the, you said that the Secretary General asked you to be bold and concrete, and I would agree that the report is very much, there are very concrete ideas in there that are bold. And one, for example, that I love is that decision making at the UN should not necessarily be by consensus, because it then allows a handful of countries to block the interests of the majority. How do you, if we take your feminist government example, how do you go about convincing at a political level those that you need to win over in order to push some of these bolder ideas through? And what can we learn from that we can apply to the field of multilateralism?
Well, that was an idea we wanted to form, and we did form the first feminist government in the world, not only in terms of fair representation, men and women in the government, but also the policies in our authorities, in the legislation. Ministers that going to the finance minister and asking for money was asked, okay, so how's the gender equality perspective dealt with in your budget? So it's about being very, very systematic, and that you can control as a government if you really want to do it. You have to be stubborn, you have to be structured and systematic. Now, convincing others about that takes time, because, as I said, many countries just shook their head and said, "What are you doing? The Swedes, what are you doing?" But when you talk to people and you say, "Hey, gender equality is a moral issue, but it's also a practical issue. Why don't we use 100% of the assets that we have walking around in the world? Why use 50%? It's stupid." And okay, and then when we could show that in peace agreements, when you involve women after war, after conflict, and you involve women in the process, the agreements are more sustainable. When you can show that, well, one or two more listen and say, okay, that perhaps could be a good idea. So it takes time, but you build arguments, you show them facts, and just keep on walking.
It sounds very much actually like what you said earlier around investing in developing countries, that it's about showing how that's in your national interest or, the interest of whatever group. So I think that's a helpful takeaway. There are two other kind of bold but concrete ideas that listeners wanted to ask you about. Rick Forster, are you online? I don't think he is. So I'll put it to you for him. He was asking whether you would support the call for a proposed UN Parliamentary Assembly, and if so, how we could get there.
I'm not sure that would be good, and that, I guess that raises one or two eyebrows. Why not? And that is because governments would always be responsible for what happens. So it depends on the mandate for the parliament. I think we need to include more people, as I said earlier, civil society, private sector, all that. That is a very wise thing to do. It depends on the mandate, because at the end of the day, it'll be the governments that are responsible for when they meet the voters, the constituencies, for what they're doing or not doing. So I'm not sure, or rather, I do hesitate on having two decision-making forces in the same organization. So it depends on the mandate.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Rick, when you listen to this. Although I do think there are various proposals, some of which are Parliamentary Assembly that would only be consultative, and others that would have broader decision-making powers. The other bold but concrete idea that comes from way back when is from Tad Daly. Tad, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Heba. Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. I am old enough to remember the 50th anniversary year of the United Nations. That's obviously almost 30 years ago. And there was an initiative then that I'm sure that at least you and Jens Orbach are familiar with, called the Commission on Global Governance. It was chaired by your predecessor,
Ingvar Carlsson.
Minister Ingvar Carlsson.
Yeah.
And this is not the only issue I care about, but it's one that I've been kind of persistent on, because one of their central recommendations for dealing with crimes against humanity and genocide and atrocities of every imaginable kind was, and I have the line right here, quote, creating a United Nations volunteer force that would be willing to take combat risks. That idea of a standing UN peace force was really part of the conversation 30 years ago during the 50th anniversary year. And it just has almost completely faded away. It really was not part of the Summit of the Future deliberations in any way. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. What has happened to that idea? And do you think it's not a bad idea for giving us a new tool to try to, if I may finally close, situations today like Sudan strike me as quintessentially appropriate, where outside intervention could make a huge difference, but there's no country willing to step up and put its own forces at risk to do so. Thanks so much.
No, I remember that well, and I think it has to do, the fact that it's faded away, I think it has to do that with the fact that UN troops and UN missions in that perspective in general has weakened, and that also has to do with the fact that more countries now say, no, we don't want anyone here, you leave, and that has weakened the whole system. The whole system, in my view, is weakened from detecting conflicts and preventing conflicts and solving conflicts and all that. All that system has weakened, and I think it has to do with that, the fact that it's so this idea seems even more revolutionary today than it did 30 years ago. That's my assumption anyhow. But I don't think it's a bad idea. I think we need something in line with that because, as I said, we need the accountability. That could be, I mean, a judicial process, yes, to make sure that people are accountable. But accountability can also be about making sure that there is a force, a multilateral force that can make a difference. So something in line with that, I think we need more of accountability, and I think, yeah, something in line with that would be good.
I have just two final questions for you. The first, building on what you have continually referred back to, which is that it is now up to us to make whatever we can out of the Pact and the outcomes of the Pact. And so I'd love to better understand how you see that happening. What does it mean for us to push these things forward?
First, again, to avoid misunderstanding, of course, I mean, responsibility lies with leaders and the prime ministers and presidents and parliamentarians and all that. So they have a responsibility on bringing this forward. They can't just go to the General Assembly, take a decision and say, okay, that was it. But my point is more that we have to be pushing and show that unfortunately, I couldn't go as early as planned to New York because for private reasons. But when I got there on the second day of the action days, and when I walked down to the UN Plaza and saw all these people, civil society people and others, I also felt the force that we do have as human beings if we come together and we express what we want and we put pressure on politicians because they listened. You know, I was told that when you look at history, it's very strange that Ronald Reagan, a hawk, was the one who actually reduced the number of nuclear warheads from, let's say, 70,000 something to 12,000. And when I read somewhere that someone was asked about how did that happen? And they said that he also heard students in the universities and other people in civil society saying, hey, we don't want this nuclear weapon because it's an immediate danger to our lives, the whole planet. And when you express that hard enough, loud enough, often enough, it also, some leaders actually listen. Perhaps they don't want it, but they feel the pressure. I need to do something. You have leaders that will never listen. Putin is one of them, and we have several leaders, they don't care. But I think some leaders do, and many enough so that we can make a difference. So if we can gather all the good forces in civil society and trade unions and all this, I think we can definitely make a difference.
Well, then I'll have to echo what Connie said in the chat, which is that this is such a wonderful conversation that is both informative and inspirational. And I would agree that you have just given us a dose of inspiration. Maybe if you can close with one more, and this is a question that I'd like to put to all of our guests on bilateral moving forward, which is if we think of the normative logic that underpinned international relations with the UN at its heart, in 1945, when the UN was created, as being principles of national sovereignty, principles of territorial integrity, a focus on the prohibition on the use of force. Which 1, 2, 3 principles do you think could guide multilateralism moving forward? And my goal in asking this is to help us lift off from some of the specific reforms that we've been talking about that are, of course, important, to a kind of broader vision of what is the UN that we need. So what would you say as the core principles of the multilateralism of the future?
I might disappoint you, but I don't want to choose. No,
you are disappointing me.
I think, yeah, but listen, I mean, for me, the first that comes to mind is the human rights. We are all human beings. We are living here a few years on Earth, and we all need respect and good. We want good lives. So the first that comes to mind is human rights. But in order to achieve that, the principle of respecting one another, respecting other territories, and understand that if I'm entitled to human rights, my brother, a sister is also entitled to that, no matter where they live. So the UN for me is built on these different pillars. So taking one away and say this is, but if I want to start somewhere, starting somewhere, it's about human rights, because that declaration is so beautifully written and it's so valid today. So if I want to start with someone, I will raise that one.
I will just inject, though, from words from your own report in the high-level advisory board breakthrough for people and planet, which is that you said we propose that our global governance system be redesigned around equitable access to global public goods. And I find that a very different framing from a global governance system that is designed around protecting national borders. So I think that in this world of interdependence is an interesting kind of shift, which of course then becomes underpinned by human rights and all the other kind of core principles that we all care about.
But they don't contradict one another. So I think it's but what we wanted to do in the high-level advisory board was to highlight the global, because it has been discussed, the global public goods. What is that? And we can't add that, but we think there is something called global public goods, and it's important, and that has to do with equal human rights. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah, equal rights to global public goods.
Absolutely,
an interesting new framing. We have covered a lot of ground. I want to thank you very much. I think you've left us with a few thoughts, particularly around the importance of narrative and how we frame what we're fighting for. That you are seeing traction in certain spaces, in particular around reform of the international financial institutions, and that it really is up to we the people to push for the kinds of changes that we want to see our governments take forward. So thank you very much, Stefan Löfven, for joining us on this first edition of Bilateral.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everybody who attended. It really shows that we are engaged.
And thank you, Heba.
And thank you, Heba. Yes, thank you, Heba.
And as I said, if you want to attend future conversations in this series, sign up for C4UN's mailing list, and then you'll be kept abreast. We'll also share the recording with all those of you who registered, as well as on our YouTube channel and website. And thank you all so very much for joining us on this UN Day event, and until next time.